but just want to start off saying a huge thank you to everyone here in the room, folks who are streaming, to the incredible team at Netroots, and to the AV IT staff who made this possible, and all the staff at the Chicago Hilton who are taking such good care of us today. We have an amazing panel today, and despite the best efforts of the weather gods, we are changing things up, doing it live. Secretary Benson joining us from the screen instead of here from the table. But we've also got Secretary Adrian Fontes from Arizona.
Hello, everybody.
Secretary Stephanie Thomas of Connecticut, and Secretary Cisco Aguilar of Nevada. Let me tell you, each of these secretaries really should be wearing capes, because by winning their races, they truly are defenders of democracy.
Although Secretary Thomas has an extra word in her title.
True.
She's Secretary of the State of Connecticut.
That's true. But in each of their states, election deniers were running as their opponents to oversee elections. But I'm not going to tell you their story. We're going to get to that in a moment and have each of the secretaries introduce themselves. We've got a few questions for each of them and for all of them, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So a few reminders before we jump in. Please stay masked while in conference spaces and not actively eating or drinking. Please keep the aisles and any marked accessible spaces open and clear for folks that need them. Thanks so much, and we are going to jump in. Since you are on screen, Secretary Benson, let's have you kick us off with a quick introduction of yourself.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, where I oversee not just our elections, but the Department of Motor Vehicles, so everything that drives and moves. So it makes me very popular. Everyone loves to visit the DMV. So very, very well known in the state. But obviously my heart and a lot of our work is not just making that piece work for everyone, but making democracy work for everyone. And on that, I'm really honored to be here with all of you. Wish I could be there in person, but next year I hopefully will be, and really get to work with these great people all the time. So glad to be here with you all.
Great. Secretary Aguilar.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Cisco Aguilar from Nevada. This is my first foray into politics. It's been an extremely exciting, important job in the state of Nevada, and to ensure that every Nevadan has the opportunity to have a voice, especially some of our marginalized community. But Kim said we wear the capes. That's not true. I have to say our election workers and our volunteers and our poll workers are truly the people who wear the cape in this process. They are the heroes of our democracy, and that's what we've made our administration about, is making sure we're taking care of the people who actually give us the opportunity to express our voice. So thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Kim.
Good afternoon. I'm Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas. Let's see, when I was born, my mother did not know she was expecting me because I have a twin, and I've been surprising people ever since.
Nice.
So I like to think outside the box and be creative. This is also, I never anticipated growing up being the first of my siblings to graduate from college, and all of these origin story things that make you believe you can't dream this large. But here I am. I served in our state house. This is my first term as secretary, and I am trying to use a creative approach to make sure that we start shifting culture away from what I call the American myth, which is that if you vote, everything will work out, just like magic. Doesn't work that way. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Adrian Fontes, Secretary of State in Arizona, and the last secretary who is also the Lieutenant Governor, because we're going to have a new office in Arizona after the 2026 election cycle. I started in the election world as the Maricopa County recorder between the election of 2016 and 2020, where we did some amazing work. And I'll echo what my friend, the Secretary from Nevada, said. It's about the folks, unleashing the potential in our staff, in our career professionals, letting them do the things that needed to be done to make sure that we cut down on provisional balloting, opened up access, registered record numbers of voters, saw record numbers of votes cast, and made sure that democracy was alive and well in Arizona. In spite of the headlines, we're actually doing pretty good. So I'm happy to be here, and I will let our fearless leader, Kim, move us on.
Certainly fearless. Don't know about leader. I'm going to start with a few questions for all of you because there are some commonalities that we should all talk about. Each of you ran against an election denier in 2022 and won. I like to point that out every single time. How did that shape your race? And was there specific messaging that worked in your states as you were talking to voters? And since you went last time, we'll start with you, Secretary Fontes.
Thanks. You know, the notion of the election enthusiast is a really interesting notion. These are folks who just don't believe in reality. And one of the things I think that was really interesting in the way that it helped shape the race was something that we did in Arizona on our side of the aisle with now Governor Hobbs and Attorney General Mays and myself. What we did was we talked across the aisle. Arizona's only got 29% now of its registered voters are Democrats. Independents or non-party designated voters are now the majority. And so we really needed to cross over. We needed to talk to folks in the middle and on the moderate right. And so we did what we needed to do, get the folks who were invested in Arizona to understand that Arizona requires a healthy democracy to be invested in as well. We spoke against craziness. We spoke against instability. We spoke against unpredictability, all of the things that chase businesses away from Arizona. We reminded people about SB 1070 and the extremist views that drove away a Super Bowl back in the olden days, back in the 90s. And we reminded folks that it is that kind of extremism that you can expect at every level and at every turn if you elect one of these extremists. Now, some of us were far more effective at sharing the message than others, but as a slate, we did very, very well. And I think democracy was a big part of it, but we talked to folks where they lived. We talked to chambers of commerce. We talked to interested business communities. We talked to the legal community, the medical community, the arts and sciences, the tech community. We talked all across the board. And the common thread, of course, was elections. And as I have said, and I'll say again, elections are the golden thread that hold every single fiber of that fabric of our society together. And if you pull that thread out, the whole thing disintegrates. That message resounded, and I think that's what helped us do the good work that we needed to do in Arizona.
I suppose I'm next. I think when most people think about Connecticut, they're surprised that I ran against an election denier as named by the Washington Post. But for me, I think what was very helpful, I believe in truth-telling and transparency. And I started saying on the campaign trail that voters are smarter than you think. They understand when they're being lied to or misled. So I led with facts. I also reframed the conversation from the get-go. You never heard me say anything about election fraud or being an election denier. What I said was there's a difference between fraud and mistakes. And by the way, every state has different election laws and voters are confused. So sometimes they make mistakes and election workers are human beings and none of them are perfect and sometimes they make mistakes. But aren't we fortunate to live in a state where we have systems in place where we can catch those mistakes? And I think that type of straightforward fact-telling really resonated with the voters of Connecticut, which is why I'm sitting here today.
I don't think anybody likes chaos, and I think some of our opponents were driving chaos. And in order to have chaos creates chaos, and I think having a stable, consistent, pragmatic approach really worked. When we were out campaigning in Nevada, whether or not it was in our urban core, it was in our rural communities, it was really resonating with the voters to say, I'm going to be pragmatic, I'm going to call a ball and a strike. We're not going to play games with our election system. And when my opponent, who I say is the leader of all election deniers in the entire country, probably one of the most dangerous opponents in America, stood up on stage with the former president and said, if I am Secretary of State, this individual will be the next president of the United States, without regard or will to the Nevada voters. And when he made that statement, that showed to Nevadans that he had a predetermined outcome already made up, and we weren't gonna allow that. My job was to ensure every Nevadan had an opportunity to express their voice and determine what Nevada wanted. Given the fact that Nevada is a battleground state, We were going to be critical in the 24 election, and Nevadans understood it. Also, chaos is not good for business or economic development. And when you're talking to business owners, you're talking about economic development organizations, they want to know that they can depend on their elected leaders to make the best decisions of their citizens. And so that's the approach we took in order to show how he was such a flawed candidate.
All right, Secretary Benson.
Yeah, in Michigan, it's really about two things. One, running for re-election, demonstrating our work to actually pound for pound make government work better for everyone. And that relies on the work we did on the customer service side of our department, actually reforming the Department of Motor Vehicles, eliminating wait times and making it a pleasant experience, frankly, and an easy effort. So having a strategy to basically say, we want you to vote, and when you vote, government also has a responsibility to work better for you, and just keeping it out of the partisan realm and just simply on results. These are the ways in which we've actually improved government services for every single citizen in the state of Michigan, and we want to keep doing that. And then secondly, drawing the distinction, as Secretary Thomas so definitely pointed out, between truth and lies. I wasn't running against a Republican. I was running against someone who wasn't telling people the truth about our elections and also wasn't willing to stand by the truth about the will of the people in past scenarios. And so why could we trust them to do that again in the future? We need someone overseeing our democracy, regardless of their political affiliation, who's going to tell citizens the truth and stand by the truth, regardless of whatever pressure they get, be it from a former president of the United States or armed protesters outside their home. And to basically rise above the political noise and deliver those types of messages. We want to make government work for everyone, and we want to make sure your voice is heard and that you have the tools to express it. That was a very simple message that contrasted quite starkly to a more partisan and chaos-laden message on the other side. And I'll just make one last point, because I think this is messaging that takes us all into the next cycle. As Cisco pointed out, as Secretary Aguilar pointed out, the goal of election deniers and the broader anti-democracy movement as a whole is three things: to create chaos, confusion, and fear, all of which designed to, at a time when our country is rapidly increasing in diversity and progressivism, deter people from participating in our democracy. So we, in response, wherever we find ourselves as pro-democracy citizens, have to seek clarity, confidence, and certainty. We've worked to develop content that gives people the confidence that their vote's going to count, that democracy is going to prevail, the clarity as to how to participate in our elections, and the certainty that when they do, the results of the election will stand. That's it. Clarity, confidence, and certainty in response to chaos, confusion, and fear can actually instill a sort of messaging environment that counters their strategy in a way that also builds and expands our democracy.
Thank you so much. I feel a little bit like Sesame Street. The letter of the day is C, chaos versus confidence, confidence and clarity. I just also feel incredibly lucky to have these folks here, especially given that dynamic.
And C for Cisco.
With that, I wanted to ask Secretary Thomas, you
From
were
Connecticut.
from Connecticut, the state.
We've got 5 C's though, right? Copper, climate, citrus, cattle, and copper.
You guys, I'm going to try and get this back on track, but I can only do so much. It really is like preschool.
Three
Be kind,
secretaries.
don't lie.
Here's the qualifier, folks. For those of you that don't know, we were all just in Washington, D.C. for the National Association of Secretaries of State conference, so we're already a little bit buggy. I know Jocelyn had a canceled flights, and Cisco was on the tarmac when the tornado hit at O'Hare, so we're going to be a little froggy.
You forgot one C, though. Go Cats, University of Arizona.
Wow. Okay, we're not even going to go down that. I'm going to time out. I am not a parent, but I play one to secretaries currently. Secretary Thomas from Connecticut.
Yes.
You were in the state legislature prior to running for secretary. How has that prepared you for the work of being secretary and your approach to expanding voting rights within the legislature? You've had some pretty big wins this year.
We have had some big
Take
wins.
a victory lap right now.
Partial wins. Most people may not realize we are currently one of the last 4 states in the nation who do not have early voting, but it finally passed, and we will have it next year. Yay! Yes, that deserves applause. Although the funding, that's a different story. So in the legislature, it actually was an eye-opening experience. So I served as vice chair of our elections committee last term. So it was a time when people went from not really thinking much about voting and talking about it all the time. And it's why I ended up running for secretary, actually, because what I saw was that such a steady drumbeat about election fraud and denialism was leading people who were otherwise not conspiracy theorists, etc., to just start saying, where there's smoke, maybe there is fire. And it became very clear to me that most people had no idea how elections worked, what the laws were, etc., which is why when I ran very much on a platform of civic literacy and trying to make that distinction between mistakes and fraud, because based on what people were telling me, I think they're making mistakes because they didn't understand how it worked. So in the legislature, I found it gave me a front seat view to how these types of theories can penetrate and infiltrate beyond sort of the fringe. And I found that to be very dangerous, and it sparked me to run. But I encourage everyone to watch what their legislatures are doing, because that is where you often first hear, even if it never makes it out of committee, the law never passes, the fact that the bill is introduced to begin with is the warning sign. So watch your legislatures.
If I could add on that too, I think both the bills being introduced, even if they have no opportunity to pass, and we see this in Congress as well, with a lot of legislation that's sort of anti-democracy being proposed by the current Republican leadership, and lawsuits as well that are filed. Both are not necessarily, both are strategic. The lawsuits may have no chance of winning because there's no evidence of wrongdoing. The legislation may have no chance of passing, but it's a strategic way to dominate the messaging environment, which is, again, their goal to create that sort of sense of chaos and confusion and fear. And so I think it's also important, as Secretary Thomas rightly pointed, is to sort of call out, talk about that legislation, even if we think it's not going to get passed, but to do so in a way that counters their messaging strategy, which is really why, in many cases, those lawsuits are getting filed, or those bills are getting filed.
I think that's a great point, and I think it transitions very nicely to Secretary Fontes. Speaking of lawsuits, your state in Arizona, I think, still has not finalized all of the lawsuits from the 2022 election.
Right.
And your opponent continues to drag his feet. Can you talk us through a little bit about the dynamics there and your opponent's unwillingness to back down?
Yeah, and it's a really odd position that we find ourselves in Arizona. I'll speak a little generally because I really don't want to talk specifically about pending litigation, but a year or so ago, former Secretary Hobbs was actually prevented from hiring outside counsel or spending any money on outside counsel, and the Attorney General, who was not a friend of hers at the time, would not issue any assistance. And so they had to be creative in how they put things together, and a lot of that lingers. Some of it's still lingering in the past budget, the budget that just got passed. So we're facing some challenges when it comes to actually representing the Department of State in Arizona and the interests of folks. The one piece of pending litigation that is pertinent to my race is in the Court of Appeals right now. I don't think it has much of a leg to stand on. So, these are sort of the waning efforts of the grifters, and it really is grift. I mean, this is one of the main reasons I think these folks file these lawsuits, is because they're going to be able to raise, $250,000, $300,000, $400,000 on something that's going to legally end up costing $65,000 or $70,000, and then they're going to do whatever they want with that money. And this is sort of the great scam, of the last couple of years, and this is one of the reasons why, our other governor, Kari Lake, and I said that with air quotes for those of you that couldn't see that, is still lingering. And this is why, some of these folks are still doing what they're doing, because we have a campaign finance system that I'm not necessarily going to complain about, but it does allow folks to perpetually campaign. And as long as you can put money into the account, there are a few restrictions on how you can spend it. And so a lot of these folks are really abusing the system, and they're using these ridiculous and frivolous lawsuits so that they can drum up campaign money so that they can just go spend it on whatever they want. And that's, I think, the biggest tragedy here. And one of the things that we like to point out is that these suits are not going to win. There's very few of them that have any real impact at all under any circumstances. The only thing that's going to happen is you're going to partially enrich a few lawyers, and you're going to end up with a fat campaign bank for these folks who are just going to continue to run on lies. And it's unfortunate. The more we point it out, I think we're kind of chipping away at the edges. But really, it's sad that these folks have been allowed to use the judiciary and our court systems for these money-making ventures. That having been said, some of these lawyers are getting sanctioned in Arizona, and some of those sanctions are adding up. And some of these lawyers, as we recently saw in California on a larger scale, are getting disbarred, or they're getting their hand slapped pretty hard by the courts. And so, the bar generally has duties that I don't think that they've been paying a lot of attention to, at least the ones that are willing to work on that side of things. So what's the overall impact? They're just making money off of it. We're pretty confident that we're going to come out ahead on all of the pending litigation, of which there are several. And on the official side of the house, at the Department of State in Arizona, there are still several bits of pending litigation as well. But as is prudent, I can't comment specifically on a lot of them detail-wise. But that's kind of where it's at.
If I may quote a friend, lawsuits are now Twitter without a word count.
Can I use that? I'm gonna use that. Yeah.
Feel free to tweet that out, everyone.
It's just another tweet without a word.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back to talking about some wins because I like winning. Secretary Aguilar, you had a really good legislative session, and tell us a little bit more about what you've done to protect election workers and to expand access in Nevada.
Absolutely. Nevada was on the right track before I even won this office, and my job is to protect that access that was developed in the 21 session. We have universal mail ballots. We have 2 weeks of early voting. We have digital voting for Nevadans living overseas. We have digital voting for our Native community now, which passed in the last recent legislative session, which is great. We also have, instead of tribal communities having to ask for poll access, they now get guaranteed access, and they can choose to opt out, which is incredible because with universal mail ballots, we had a 25% increase in Native voting within our system. That's incredible. Giving a community who hasn't had access have access. And we go back to my opening comments. Elections are about the people who run them. They are the heroes of democracy. And on the campaign trail, I learned so much from some of these poll workers. They are working in fear because of the current environment. We cannot have people going to work in fear or to volunteer in fear, especially when 80% of election workers and volunteers are women. Those are our daughters, those are our wives, those are our sisters, those are our mothers. We don't want them to be in these situations. So immediately we started looking at what is a solution that these workers know we have their back and we're going to protect them. I went to our Republican governor as soon as I took office and said, this is what I want to do. I want to protect our election workers. I want to make it a felony to harass or intimidate them. And him being the former sheriff of the largest county in Nevada, he agreed. And then we went and proposed legislation. We worked with every constituency that had an interest, everybody from the ACLU to, law enforcement, to the DA's office, to the PD's office, and said, this is the language we're proposing. Tell us what you'd like to change now so that when we go to hearing, we can have a real conversation about the policy. Everybody came to the table. I'm proud to say this bill passed out of committee. They suspended the rules to pass it immediately to the floor. It passed unanimously on both floors in Nevada, went to the governor. Thank you.
Good job.
And he signed it. He celebrated that legislation with me. And that's a huge thing. Not only did we do that, we also passed anti-doxing legislation for our election workers. So now that they can work and do the job they need to do without fear or retaliation. And unfortunately, there's a group of individuals who have filed a lawsuit against us to invalidate the legislation. But you know what? I don't see it as something negative. I see it as a positive, because what it's doing is driving the attention to our poll workers. And it's making them look like the heroes that they should be. So super excited about that. We also passed some significant investment from a financial perspective. We're investing $30 million into a top-down voter registration system and to an election management system that, as our leaders of elections at the 17 counties we have, will be able to look at real data and know how Nevadans are voting, and then be able to strengthen that access even more. It gives me the opportunity as secretary to say, here's what Nevada voters want, this is the data, and this is how we're gonna do it. And it's crazy, you know, we have 2 major urban centers in Nevada, 17 rural counties. 10 of our 17 clerks are brand new. They are doing 3 different jobs in their rural counties. They are the election administrator, they are the assessor, they're the treasurer. They used to spend about a third of their time on those jobs. Now they're spending about 60% of their time on elections and still have the other thirds to do. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to operate efficiently with technology. I say this all the time, and I know it's very trivial, but the fact that we have universal mail ballot, you should be able to track your ballot like you track a pizza. We have that technology. And so that everybody is confident and it's transparent in our system. And so I'm really excited about doing that. So those are our great wins. There's more, and I could go on, but those are really the highlights.
And now I'm thinking about pizza. Secretary Benson, you have seen a lot of changes in Michigan since you got elected in 2018. And in 2022, it was a pretty great year for democracy. Not only were you the top vote getter in the state, but there are now, yes, there are now pro-democracy majorities in your legislature, as well as the governor and AG, and you've had some really strong ballot measures pass in Michigan. What does that mean for the state, and how has it increased access, and what is your role in overseeing all of this?
Well, I mean, it's been transformative. We've had, you know, in relation to all of that, the highest turnout elections back to back in 2020 and 2022 that we've ever had in history. Michigan led the nation in 22 with the number of young people and the percentage of young citizens who voted in our elections. So the other side of that is when you know, and all of us here do all this work around election policies and laws, and it turns out, as Michigan's story underscores, if you implement all of these best practices, election day registration, early voting, no reason absentee voting, ballot tracking systems, and then you educate voters on how to take advantage of all of them from soup to nuts, you know, older voters, younger voters, everywhere in between, it actually works. You actually do demonstrably increase turnout among underrepresented communities. And there's a lot more we can do on that, but our story over the last 5 years has been really just the beginning of Michigan working together through voters leading, because these were all started with initiatives. An initiative to amend our Constitution to create a Citizens Redistricting Commission to eliminate gerrymandering. An initiative to amend our state constitution to create automatic voter registration and election day registration and no reason absentee voting. An initiative to create early voting. So all of these were voter-driven reforms as well, which means voters have ownership over them and are helping to implement them in a way that's really effective at achieving the goals of increasing participation among every demographic. So that's really the story, number one. It's sort of like the foundation of the story. Then the other side of the story is look at the policies that are at the table and being enacted, from meaningful climate change to meaningful gun safety resolutions to meaningful budget decisions that are creating historic investments in education, to changes to our economy that are enabling us to become a growing economy in a state that was just yesterday named one of the top 10 places to do business. So the great thing is when you make democracy work, you make everything work for everyone. And that's what all of us here as pro-democracy advocates, all of us in this audience have really dedicated so much of our lives to fighting for. The Michigan story demonstrates that when you're successful in those battles, guess what? All the policies actually do align with the needs of people and the people we're fighting for. And so it's been really exciting to be a part of it. It's been really exciting to be the chief advocate for all of these policies and implementing all of these policies. And it's replicable in states all around the country, and really, again, shows if you put voters front and center in determining their future, particularly young voters and historically marginalized communities that have been left out of those discussions, the policy you get out at the other side is truly going to make our state and ultimately our nation better for everyone.
That's great. It's very impressive. So we've talked a little bit about some successes. I'd like to turn it a little bit to talk about some of the challenges on the road ahead. Right now, this will be a question for all of you. What do you think the biggest challenges facing our democracy as we move forward are? We'll go ahead and go to you, Secretary Fontes.
Well, the single greatest challenge facing our democracy is Donald Trump. I'll just say it. He has single-handedly exploited a dark feeling in some people that is come to dominate the political discourse. The reason we're sitting here having this particular discussion, the reason Secretaries of State came into the fore in our national narrative, the reason we have election denialism, the reason January 6th happened, all of the reasons that all of the bad things have happened since 2016 is because Donald J. Trump got elected president. And that's just real. Now, as the chief election administrator in Arizona, some people will say, well, that's a little dangerous for you to say because that's pretty political. Well, it's true. It's not political. Because if he ends up winning Arizona in 2024, and it's a solid election like I anticipate it will be, I'll have to certify his victory the same way I administered my own loss in 2020. Because I have enough honor and integrity to make sure that the work that our election workers have done, as Secretary Aguilar points out, is honored, and I'll do that. But if you ask me what the threat is, that's the threat. And all the folks that blindly follow the nonsense in spite of, I can't tell you how many court cases, and it really becomes exhausting to repeat the litany of proof against the big lie, of proof against the scams and the grift. That's the biggest threat to our democracy right now. And it has infected just about every conversation. It has driven one American from another. And really, that's the point of it all. The point is to, remove this notion of civic faith that we've had, this notion of, some people say, well, we took these things for granted. No, we believed in one another. We didn't take the system for granted. We took the people doing it for granted. We had faith in them. We had faith in our neighbor Republicans and independents and libertarians and Democrats and Greens and progressives and conservatives who were actually doing the work of our elections. We believed that they would follow their oath. And one person has determined that that's not good and has helped a whole bunch of other people rise all kinds of suspicions as against American against American. And that destruction of our civic faith towards one another, that is the symptom of the problem. And the problem is, this one guy's got an outsized voice. So in typical fashion, I may take a little heat for that, but the bottom line is that's the truth. And if you don't want the truth, don't ask me the question.
Duly noted. Secretary Thomas, Connecticut's a little bit different than the other
that's
three
hard
states
to follow.
on the panel.
Yeah, Connecticut is different, but deeply purple. When you were speaking, though, I like to reframe, and I think Donald Trump is perhaps a symptom of something that is much deeper, and I think the bigger threat, which is that democracy is not static, right? Things change, times change, and I think people have forgotten what it means to live in a representative democracy, no matter where you sit across the political spectrum. What does it mean to do something beyond voting? When you think about change that was created in this country, people died for change. But now we have the beauty, we have access to information, sometimes more information than we should have access to. And I'm trying to really shift this culture to think about a representative democracy. You can't just vote for someone. You have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to what they're doing before you vote for them. You have to pay attention after you vote for them. You have to back them up to support the things that you believe, and you need to let them know when they're doing something that you don't believe in. And if we, the people, had been doing that all along, Donald Trump would have never gotten elected. Or if he had, he would have actually been representative of the majority of Americans, which we know he was not. So I believe ignorance is the biggest threat. So I encourage everyone to remember what it means to actually live in a democracy.
It's information. It's making sure that the information the voter is receiving is accurate, especially in Nevada where we have a large Latino population. Because we speak a different language, we communicate in a different way, the auto checks or the truth checkers don't always understand the information that's being delivered. So that we need to make sure that in these situations, we have the ability to make sure the right information is getting to the voter. The other is remaining, I served as chair of the Nevada Athletic Commission, which regulates boxing and UFC. That was a regulator position, which is similar to the Secretary of State's position. You are a regulator of elections. You have to rise above the fray. You have to maintain control, and you have to maintain a position of authority, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, to say this is the law, this is what we're going to do, and this is in the best interest of all voters in the state of Nevada. So maintaining that perspective and remaining strong, because there's a lot of times you get real angry when you hear information or you hear something that's occurring and you have to say, this is the responsibility of a secretary in this moment, and we have to maintain the trust for all voters. It's just not a group of voters, but it's all voters.
Great. Secretary Benson.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a kind of layer to all on top of all this, because I think that what I've seen over the last several years is that whether it's the former president or other politicians who have chosen to embark on a political strategy that ignores the will of the people and tries to undermine it, even if it leads to violence, is that in defining the threat more broadly, we can actually find something to be hopeful about. And so to me, the threat is symptomatic of the rise of Donald Trump. It's symptomatic of the lies and misinformation that we're seeing, but it's really rooted in sort of the historical challenges we've always had with expanding democracy, which is rooted in racism and rooted in just simply plethora of lies that have been utilized to divide our country and to cause people to lose faith in their own voice and their own power. And so you have candidates who have found it as a political strategy, using racism, using white supremacy, using neo-Nazism, using lies and threats as a means and pathway to power. There have been countless examples of that in many countries throughout our history. So we have to recognize that threat, but in that find our greatest hope, which is that how have those threats been overcome in the past in our country and in elsewhere? It's when the people work together to learn the truth, become critical thinkers, have access to the truth, and be empowered through that truth to speak out and in support of a multiracial, multi-ethnic governing body democracy that really is the basis of the principles our country was founded on, and to fight for that. So to me, we find the best antidote to the greatest threat of today, which is and continues to be social stratification, racial stratification, and that's why we're also seeing this battlefront emerge in education and against critical race theory. It's all connected to this desire to divide and create chaos and confusion as a way of promoting authoritarianism, which is in direct contrary to really who we are as a country, which is a democracy where everyone has a voice and everyone has a right to power in our country. And so how do we really, I think, focus, in my view, counter all that by focusing our conversations with everyone, regardless of who they vote for or what their perspectives are or where they live, on their power and the power they have as rural voters, as urban voters, as young voters, as older senior voters, as college students, to shape their future and to shape the future of this country. And if we really, and again, that's what Michigan's story has been, empowering citizens to change our laws, to create a stronger democracy and protect our fundamental rights and freedoms. If we lean in on that and really counter the misinformation and the lies and the racism with truth-telling and facts and collaboration and community, then we regain our democracy, we expand it, and we emerge from this moment more aligned with the principles of our country and America than we ever were. And so my hope is that we use this time, this challenging time that we're in, to ultimately emerge from these threats with a healthier, more robust and stronger democracy than ever before. And if you look, you can see signs that indeed, I believe that's where we're headed. And that's where we must be headed in a moment where our country is becoming increasingly diverse, increasingly progressive, with an opportunity to really become a full democracy that lives and breathes and represents those values.
I think you make an incredible point there on that connective tissue that runs between everything. The folks that you all were running against in 2022, in addition to being election deniers, were also very loudly outspoken about stripping away other rights, particularly around reproductive freedom and access to abortion, among others. So I would like to just invite you all to talk a little bit more about the connective tissue and how you approached it, and how that brought you into running for Secretary of State. Do you want to start, Secretary Aguilar?
Sure. I had the opportunity to build a school in one of our most vulnerable neighborhoods. There were kids like me who came from families where their parents weren't well educated, but they worked extremely hard. And on election day, I went on campus, had a conversation with the students and said, hey, did your parents vote? They're not 18 yet, so they're not going to vote. And they said, no. And I said, well, why? And they said, because we're being told our voice doesn't matter. Clark County is the 5th largest school district in the country. It's majority minority with extremely disappointing academic results. And I just thought, if I'm going to continue to do the work I'm doing in the education space, it requires access to the ballot box for our most vulnerable communities, and it's this community. And when I heard the students say that, and they believed it, it broke my heart. And I said, this has to change. And that's when I really got the fire in my belly to say, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm supposed to do. I wasn't thinking about a political career. And the great thing about it is I could run my campaign because it didn't change my life. If I didn't win, I would just go back to doing what I was doing before. But the fact that I had an opportunity to put it all out there was a great way for me to stand up for my students and for my community.
Great. Secretary Thomas, you want to talk about some of the connective tissue in your purple state?
I'm trying to think back. It's funny. When I first got involved in politics, it was because I just simply thought, when I got involved in my community volunteering, I started sitting in the same rooms with many people in elected office, and I thought, wow, there's really a lack of representation here, and no one is saying X or Y, and I thought, I don't think they know X or Y exists. And I had spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector, which put me in touch with all different types of people who are suffering because government has not solved many issues. But people literally did not know about these issues. And when I ran for secretary, I decided after my time in the House that fear-mongering, belittling others was something I would not do. I actually don't know what the stances were of my opponent because I didn't care. I stayed focused.
I do.
I stayed focused 100% on what I believed and what I would do. And I don't know if he was off talking about reproductive rights or whatever. I just did what I did because I trust voters. And I believe that if they get a message that appeals to them, they will vote for you. And if they won't, that is actually what a democracy is. So, election denial, yes, the job was about elections and business services, which our office handles. I stayed very much in that lane. And again, here I am, I think 13 or 14 points ahead.
We're all very glad for that.
Yeah, I think for me, my first foray into politics was in 2016 when Maricopa County failed to open enough polling places and we had 4- and 5-hour long lines, and I was pissed off, and so I ran for office. But I was a kid who was raised on Schoolhouse Rock, and when I was a first grader, I learned how to play "You're a Grand Old Flag" on the auto harp. Right? It was a very, I'll just say, honestly, I was well indoctrinated into the patriotism of America, but the real patriotism, right? It's values over face. It's the process over the parade. That was really the American values that I grew up with. And the connective tissue for me was the upholding of that fundamental right to vote. Because so many people didn't just get it by right. People fought for it. People died for it. Women were dragged in the streets. Fire hoses were knocking American citizens down in the streets. Dogs were loosed on American citizens because all they wanted was the right to vote. This wasn't a right that was just given. It was hard-earned for a lot of us. And the fact that in 2016, over 100,000 voters, some estimates say, weren't allowed the right to vote. They weren't allowed that constitutional right. That pissed me off, and that's why I ran for county recorder. And I didn't win my reelect in 2020, which was the hard lesson, because I wanted to keep doing that work. I really did. And what I realized was that the motive to run and the motive to serve has to be served. They have to operate in two different worlds. And this is one of the things where I'll step definitely into the world of the politics here. We can govern for everyone. We can, and we must govern for everyone. That's what the oath is, right? If, you know, whatever the outcomes are in 2024 or any special elections we have between now and then, if the election goes well, we'll certify it and that'll be that. Winners are winners and losers are losers. That's governing. Campaigning is a very different thing. And I think one of the mistakes that we make, and I'll say we on the political left because that's where I sit, generally, we make the mistake of campaigning like we want to govern. We want to be kind. We want to be generous. We want to be open. And we want to be consistent. We want to be authentic. Well, look, I am an authentic warrior when it comes to protecting people's rights. But when it comes to winning the contest of a campaign, I'm also going to be an authentic warrior. And I'm not going to be kind to everyone because I have an opponent. I'm not going to be generous to everyone because there are people who are trying to beat me. And so what is the connective tissue? The connective tissue is being smart enough to be able to balance out the notion of governing as opposed to the notion of campaigning, and being able to understand that you can be an authentic person, not a manufactured candidate or a manufactured politician once you get there. You can be authentic in a hard, aggressive campaign that uses truth-telling, even if it offends someone on the other side. Because if the truth is the truth, the offense is their problem. And still be able to govern with integrity, and still be able to uphold every voter's rights, every community's rights. So to me, the connective tissue is this. We are, as has been indicated, we as voters, all of us, are a little bit smarter than politicians will give us credit for. And we can distinguish between those two roles that we play. I am not playing the same role as the chief election officer and regulator of elections as I did when I was a candidate. They're different roles. And I think the vast majority of Americans can tell the difference between the two. And the mistake that I made in 2020, which I will never make again, is that I ran my campaign as if I was governing. And that was a mistake, and that's why I didn't win. And then we came back in 22 and kicked his ass. So.
Secretary Benson, you want to wrap us up on this one, and then I'm going to go to the audience.
So I started my career, as I think many of you know, at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and investigating hate groups and hate crimes and neo-Nazis and white supremacist organizations undercover throughout the country at the age of 19, which is a whole other book. But I spent a lot of time in Selma while I lived in Montgomery, and was really deeply inspired and given a sense of almost responsibility of the work that we have to do. One, the sacrifices, the deaths, the lives that were lost so that we could have a right to vote that lives up to that promise in our Constitution of one person, one vote for every citizen in our country, and how much unfinished business there was to make that real. And as the daughter of two special education teachers, I knew how unequal our educational opportunity is in our country and how unequal access to good, well-paying jobs and economic prosperity is for so many in our country. And we don't have a promise of equity and equality, of economic attainment or educational opportunity, although we should. But we do have a promise that on election day everyone is equal, that everyone has an equal amount of political power in our country if we all leverage it and use it. And we weren't meeting that promise. So how could we be a country that is truly equal and just for all if that first fundamental promise of equality on election day was not fulfilled? And I thought, if I can just dedicate my own work in life to ensuring that that one promise of one person, one vote is a reality for every citizen, then we can elect policymakers and see leaders respond and govern appropriately, whether it's a clean environment for all, educational opportunity for all, economic justice and prosperity for all. It all starts at the ballot box. And so I became an attorney because I thought that was the way to protect and enforce the Voting Rights Act, which was, of course, what the Selma and Bloody Sunday led to, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we saw how weakened that has become over the last several years, and at the same time, how elevated these roles of secretaries of state have become, the chief election officers who occupy this critical role. That could either go one way, as we saw in the 2000 election with Katherine Harris interfering with the recount, as we saw in 2004 with Ken Blackwell in Ohio not allowing enough voting machines in Cleveland and Columbus, leading to 8-hour wait times. We see examples of these offices being used in a way that counters that one person, one vote promise. And so I wanted to be someone who did the opposite. I wrote a book on how to do that, and I ran because I wanted to believe and demonstrate that through a Secretary of State position, you could actually build a healthier, more robust democracy. And it's been great to be in Michigan at a time when so many things have come together to enable us to demonstrate that to the nation, all alongside these great challenges. And I think what I've seen throughout this work over the last 2 decades is that we all have a responsibility to, in this moment, ensure that we're working together in every sector to build and expand our democracy and really take this nation into that multiracial, multi-ethnic governing coalition of a democracy that we have the opportunity to be, and show the world that we can be. And we are at a precipice where we'll either go in that direction or we'll go backwards towards where we'll allow division, divisiveness, and voter suppression and other terrible things to rule the day. And the 2024 election, to me, is really about that choice. And it's going to manifest itself in lots of different ways, but it's really, are we going to be that country we have the opportunity to be, or are we going to fall victim to the divisiveness that has plagued our country throughout its history? And the answer to that question is going to be decided by who shows up at the polls. And that's our charge moving forward, to make sure that everyone shows up, to make sure when they do, as chief election officers, their vote counts and their voice is heard, and the results of the election stand and are an accurate reflection of the will of the people, and that we defend that to the end, no matter what it takes. And to know, for all of us, to know that we can't do it alone. We're working together as secretaries, but we also need to work together as Americans across every sector to make that a reality. And if we do, we will and we can. And indeed, that is what will save our country, all of us working together to get to that higher ideal.
Excellent. I'm going to open it up to audience question and answers. All right.
Let's go.
Whew. All right. I'm going to start, red shirt right there. You can yell and I'll repeat it.
Well, it was going to be a minute. So my name is Barbara Smith-Warner, and I'm with the National Vote at Home Institute. We promote voting at home, which some people call universal vote by mail, all that good stuff. We promote it to increase voters' access to, use of, and confidence in voting at home. And I'm just very struck by how the 4 of you represent states that have, of our 4 different categories of vote at home accessibility. Nevada is a fully voted home state. I happen to be a former legislator from Oregon, where we started vote at home in 2000, lots of good stuff there. So this has been a fantastic transition for me to spread the gospel to other states. But so you've got Nevada, another fully voted home state, and it might surprise you to know there are 8 states and DC, all fully voted home now. Then next is Arizona, which has long been no excuse needed for an absentee ballot and permanent absentee. Over 70% of your voters, I believe, regularly vote absentee.
We're at about 90 now.
Oh, is it that high?
Yeah.
Okay, see, thank you. And then Michigan, just in that great ballot measure in 22, you're shifting from no excuse to no excuse single sign up. And Connecticut, finally, the other great thing that your legislature did was pass a bill. It has to go to a constitutional vote next year.
Yes.
To go from no excuse required to no excuse. So thank you all for reflecting that in the range of your states. And I just am, I believe that voting at home, centering the voter in the work, right? If you think about whether it's DoorDash or ordering things online, we all bring the stuff to us, right? And that's what voting at home does. We say vote at home and not vote by mail because it's the idea of you bring it there and then you return it in a variety of ways. So I just wanted to thank you all for your engagement on that and see if you had differences you've seen it make, and just urge you all to, at your next Secretary of State meeting, continue to engage with your colleagues who are not quite as far down the road as you are.
I have a quick comment to one of your colleagues at the Vote at Home Institute, Amber McReynolds, who used to be the election director at Denver, Colorado, who's amazing. Anybody in the election administration world knows her. We stole the ballot tracking system from Denver, put it in place in Maricopa County. Cisco's talking about it like tracking your
Statewide.
pizza.
Yeah.
And it is one of those pieces of technology that's super inexpensive. It's super great. The voters absolutely love it. And that really increases access. It increases confidence more than just about anything else that we've ever done. So when you see her next, thank her. And if we really pay close attention to what the voters in Arizona did, and I'll just give you a really quick anecdote. We started our no excuse absentee balloting by every cycle you had to send a postcard and send it back. And that got so expensive by the time, from 1992 to 2007, it got so expensive with over half of our voters choosing to vote by mail, and it slowly but surely increased. We went to the permanent early vote list where you just sign up once, and then it went up into the high 70s. And of course, after 2020, the legislature took the permanent off of the permanent early vote list because, and Governor Ducey signed that. But the bottom line is we were already well into 85% of our voters choosing to vote early. So anybody that has any doubts about whether or not folks want to vote at home, the proof is in the pudding. And I know Arizona is only one state, but that's a great example of how slowly but surely it was really word of mouth because nobody really promoted it that much. We became a great majority vote at home state because that's what voters want.
I think, Secretary Fontes makes a great point, but we got to push even farther. Every new voter is a digital native. They've grown up with a phone in their hand. And when you show them a mail ballot, a paper ballot, they go, how archaic is this? We are not used to this. This is not accustomed to our generation. And so we have to look at it. Look, we're a superpower. We're being attacked every day by other superpowers, but we're the best. We cannot be in Estonia, which they have complete digital voting, but we can start to build the security to allow us to increase access through a digital platform. And I'm not saying it's today, but it's a conversation we need to continue to have, and we need to pressure those to start to build that security infrastructure to be able to make sure that it can happen in the future.
This is a good time for me to plug a different subject. Federal investment in our election system
Preach.
and stuff.
Preach.
Secretary Benson?
Yeah, I mean, that's it right there. What we have seen, you can have great intentions and great best practices, but you need the funding, and for far too long, for far too often, we've run our elections on a shoestring budget when at the same time, the costs of both building the election infrastructure, ensuring it's safe and secure, and then educating voters about it while countering misinformation continues to escalate. So we can't continue to, I believe, state and federal authorities have a responsibility to provide sustained funding for the elections that undergird their entire governments. And so I think all of us are aligned to trying to seek that funding. It boggles my mind that it is such a heavy lift to simply get, what is in relative numbers a very small percentage of money, given all the funds that are available at the federal level for a sustained source of investment in our elections. But they're all going to jump on us if we don't meet the expectations. We need them to be part of our team and be part of investing in our democracies and partner in that. And that we're going to keep fighting for that, and we hope all of you will join us too.
Great. We'll go right here.
I'm Madeline Schweitzer. I'm the Candidate Research Director for Project Keystone out in Pennsylvania. I just want to thank you for an excellent segue into my question, because it is about funding to do with election administration. So in Pennsylvania, we passed we had no mail-in voting until 2019, got it in just under the wire for the pandemic and whatnot. However, that was also passed with a $0 line item budget, so there was no funding for implementation of mail-in voting.
I think Stephanie Thomas knows some stuff about that.
Yeah, and so that led to, and I'm not sure in terms of your specific states, but I think that it was kind of a national kind of topic in terms of we turned to private funding, particularly through the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which the Republicans then, or conservatives, far-right people, messaged as being kind of this sucker bucks. I literally saw a truck outside of the digital advertisement of this conference just driving by today. talked, I mean, obviously, I think we would all love to have government funding for election administration. That seems so, to, you know, Secretary Benson's point, that seems so fundamental. But just a little bit of a discussion around some of the, you know, the dollars and cents of it all, and as well as kind of the role, if any, of private funding in the system.
I'm just going to repeat this back for folks who are streaming. The question is, in addition to government funding, the role of private funding, particularly regarding some of the stuff that moved in 2020. So
One of the basics, and I've spoken a lot with, in fact, I met with Senator Padilla, former secretary in California, and Senator Klobuchar, and we talk about this all the time. Name one other piece of function of our government that is constitutionally mandated, regulated significantly by the federal government onto the states, and is also designated critical infrastructure that does not have sustained federal funding. The only one is election administration. So that's kind of our baseline right there. In Arizona, the quote-unquote Zuckerbucks were outlawed. So it really is catch as catch can right now. We've got a little bit of extra in the last HAVA pitch that I think we got this past spring, and there was a little bit extra in the budget. The Elections Assistance Commission, which was created by HAVA, had their funding in the House version of the recent budget has been zeroed out. And I'll just take the minute to talk about some of the background stuff. So the notion that funding even exists in some places, we have some colleagues across the country who won't take federal money. They won't apply for any of those HAVA dollars, and they won't even act as a pass-through to their county and municipal election administrators because of their political and ideological proclivities. So funding is a critical issue. I just kind of wanted to lay that groundwork.
I can talk about, because I was there in 2020, which when we dealt with this, and actually it was part of a strategic effort to build partnerships in the philanthropic community to ensure, particularly in the battleground states, that we had the funding we need to operate these what we anticipated to be high turnout elections. Many citizens in all of the states we represent, in addition to Georgia and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, would be voting by mail for the first time, given the pandemic. So we needed more funds, and we got some from the federal government, and we turned to the philanthropic community for partnerships to enable us to meet those needs. So in states like Arizona and Michigan at the time, still in Michigan at the statewide level, we can't accept philanthropic money unless there's a legislative act to enable us to do that for elections, but locals can. C3s were also key to help us receive funds to educate voters. Those still remain even in states that don't allow government entities to accept philanthropic dollars. C3s can and develop partnerships to help meet certain needs, particularly at the local level. And then we saw states that were able to take those funds directly to the government later have that outlawed. In Michigan, voters actually responded to that by having an amendment to our state constitution in the proposal that was passed in 2022 to formally enable any local election entity to accept philanthropic support for election functions. So that is now actually in our constitution as a promise for local election officials. But of course, remember, fear, confusion, and chaos. The fear has been through misinformation, deeply woven into many psyches, and even some lawsuits that were filed and subsequently dismissed because they were frivolous and baseless, but still accomplished their goal of making people afraid to take this philanthropical support, even though it was, in many cases, what was needed to ensure we had enough people and machines and PPE at the time to meet our needs in 2020. So I think we can't give up on the importance of, especially given the real dynamics of federal and state funding, we have to still find ways to develop public-private partnerships in a way that operates transparently and with integrity, ensure that we're able to deliver democracy to every citizen in this country. And so I would implore the philanthropic community to recognize that role, to the C3 community to recognize the important partnerships that we still need you to be involved in to help us educate voters and prepare citizens to counter misinformation and everything in between. And then we also still need to make that case to all those lawmakers in the state and federal system consistently that we wouldn't need to try to find these partnerships if they simply just provided a sustained source of funding. But I don't think we should bank on that. We should still find the partnerships. It just is tiring because we've got a lot of work to do. And we shouldn't, among those list of duties of election officials, it shouldn't be figure out how to make ends meet. Like lawmakers and those setting the budget for our state and local and federal government should be bearing that burden and meeting it instead.
Secretary Amos?
Yes, thank you. Two things. One, I think it's really important how we talk about things. And because I spent 30 years in the nonprofit sector, I see what happens when private entities, C3s, et cetera, come into play. Then the government says, oh, good, someone's doing it, and we can wash our hands of it. So I don't think we should let up the pressure of state and federal funding because everything Adrian said is 100% correct. There are good reasons in this space for there to be separation around some things. Something like public education, great for third parties. What I would love to see in this country is get out the vote effort, separate it from political parties and political candidates, because that by its very definition limits. I know in Connecticut, if there's a town that is one party dominant, guess what? They don't advertise that much, and voters are the ones who lose out because they are not getting those reminders. We also have a fantastic public campaign finance program, so people can't afford to go on television, et cetera, because we're not spending that much money. So getting private entities to do some of that common work that is just good for democracy is where I think that effort should be spent.
Anything to add?
I'm good. I'm just
Okay,
saying,
great.
lack of funding creates reactionary decision-making instead of strategic. If we had a source of revenue dedicated to secretaries or voting, we can make strategic decisions that makes the voting process much stronger. But when it's dealt out in increments that you don't know, you're going to make reactionary decisions. And when you make reactionary decisions, you always don't get the best decisions.
Great. Right, back there.
We're seeing a huge amount of poll workers and kind of officials leaving their posts before the elections. I'm curious what all of y'all's plans are for the coming elections, how you're going to prepare for that. Obviously, seeing this in Arizona, but seeing this across the country as well.
Yeah, just for folks at home, just the question was about the exodus of poll workers and election workers in the field and what folks are doing about that.
Nevada, we passed SB 406, which makes it a felony to harass or intimidate election workers. We passed an anti-doxing law. It's making sure that we understand we need election workers and getting out the message that poll workers and volunteers of elections are, again, the heroes of democracy. If we don't have the human component to our election process, we are not going to see the elections that we deserve as Americans or as citizens of our states.
In Connecticut, we're trying to heighten awareness about poll workers and the fact that they're your neighbors and people you know. So we are doing poll worker appreciation events in every town, and we're inviting and we give awards to people who have served for 10 years or more. We bring out local press, local dignitaries, and the poll workers are very excited. They spread the word, and we're hoping to move that into a greater recruitment effort next year.
We'll go to Secretary Fontes and then have Secretary Benson wrap us up.
I know you mentioned Arizona, and it's a particularly hard circumstance. In 12 of our 15 counties, we've lost one or both our elected county recorder and appointed election director, and in one county, we've already lost 2 of each since 2020. So it is a dire situation. The encouraging thing is this: the folks that are stepping up into these positions, they're coming in eyes wide open. They're not thinking this is some sleepy bureaucratic back office that pops up once every couple of years, has a few headaches, and then goes back to, being sleepy. They get it. They understand the HR challenges, the IT challenges, the logistical challenges, sort of all of the supply chain stuff, and then the time pressure challenges, plus the political stuff, and oh, by the way, the threats to your life, and et cetera. So these are folks who are really, they're in it, and they get it, and that's very, very encouraging. And what we've done is we've modified the traditional 2-year cycle of election officer certification so that it's asymmetrical now. It used to be 5 days butts in seats. It's now 3 days of that and 2 days online. and all of the courses are online, so folks can go back and re-watch particular sections. So we're really using technology to help folks who are out on the front lines to take care of that stuff, their own education the way they need to. We are engaging in a simplification of the elections procedures manual, which starting under Secretary Reagan, Secretary Michelle Reagan, by the way, former Secretary of State, was really beefed up with a whole bunch of lean one-way stuff, and then it went the other way, and we just wanted to get back to basics because, you know, if you're a veteran like me, you know that if you get the basics right, you're going to do a good job. All the fluff will come along. So we're really focusing on that for the Elections Procedures Manual to help those 15 counties and their new folks do it well. And then one of the things we really wanted to do with our budget, which we weren't successful at getting, was to bring in a couple of different trainers and some other legal folks to ease the load on those folks when those questions came up. Thankfully, I was able to assemble a team at the Secretary's office that has the kinds of experience that we need. My Special Projects and Innovation Director has been in elections for 30 years. The State Election Director is probably the most experienced election attorney in Arizona, having represented every single one of our 15 counties on both sides of the courtroom in trial and appellate courts. So she's phenomenal. My Assistant Secretary of State, Keely Varvel, is amazing. So we've got this amazing team at the Secretary's office to lend that support. Are we going to have a rough road? Yes, it's a human endeavor, and human beings make mistakes. We see that across the country. But what we're really doing is trying to give whatever support we have the resources to give. You know, God willing and the creek don't rise, we won't fall short.
Secretary Benson?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have 83 county clerks and 1,500 local clerks. And for the last several years, really even leading into the 2020 election, we have built a lot of connective tissue and invested a lot of state funds, including HAVA funds and CARES Act funding, to provide security support, training, resources. I regularly speak with our clerks, particularly of the 8 or 10 largest communities, to say, what else do you need from us? By providing that support, we've been able to limit turnover and at the same time be aware of when turnover is occurring so that we can be a part of recruiting and training the incoming clerk or a local election official. We've buffered that by having a statewide recruitment effort and include partnerships with the American Bar Association and Veterans Associations and educational organizations and colleges to recruit tens of thousands of new election workers. So there's never a shortage. We also have like an emergency 100 or so election workers available to fill in any vacancies that emerge on election day. So we have multiple layers of both recruiting and expanding and protecting. So we keep people, but if people need to depart, we provide support for the incoming new leadership. We've got plenty of election workers to ensure that staffing needs are met. And then passing legislation as Nevada has done to protect the safety of our election workers. And that communication amongst all of us and really projecting this team of democracy has been critical at leading us to the point where we now are, which is, you know, on election day in 2022, there was a lot of anxiety. We weren't sure. There were a lot of things we were keeping an eye on, a lot of things we were concerned about. And I visited my first precinct of the day, not really sure what I was going to see. And as someone who's visited a lot of precincts and voting locations throughout my career, there's always a little bit of a sort of like, I don't know, quietness to them, or I guess is a nice way to say it, or just sort of almost like a sleepiness or slowness sometimes on certain days, or a frenetic energy and sort of stress on others. What I saw when I walked into this voting location blew me away. There were probably 20 election workers there and sort of a supervisor worker. There was such determination to get the job done, to do it right, such pride in the work that they were doing. And I'm starting to see that at clerks associations at the state and local level, clerks associations also around the country that I've been speaking to. So yes, turnover is real. And yes, we've got a lot of work to do, all of us as a community, to make sure we fill positions and we're ready to go for 24. But what we're seeing, as Secretary Fontes alluded to, is the growth of an energy within the election administration community of pride, determination, and grit to get the job done in this moment. And that, to me, is sort of one of the indicators I take to feel like we're going to emerge from this challenging time with a stronger and healthier democracy as a result. And it's going to be, I think, in part because we're going to see so many Americans step up to the plate, proudly serving as election workers and clerks. And I encourage, everyone you talk to, all of you here, to consider in some way being a person in the election system if you're not already, because that is what is going to save democracy, but it's also what's going to ensure we get through this moment and thrive.
Thank you. We are at time, but I'm going to do one speed round question because I know we didn't get to everything, but what is one thing you would like folks in this room and streaming to know that we didn't get to today? And just super quick, Secretary Fontes.
Well, you're going to hate the fact that I'm going to tell everyone you are the outgoing executive director of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. You raised over 10 times as much money as anybody else ever has when it was critical. And Kim, you deserve a lot of credit for that. And she hates that I just did that, but good work deserves credit. 30-something million dollars, and I think everybody up here was a little bit of a beneficiary of that. We
Not
did a lot,
Connecticut, we can't accept funding.
Oh,
I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't.
I
for the
wouldn't
work
be
that
sitting here if it wasn't for Kim and her efforts either. So that's what I want these folks to know. Aside from also, to repeat what Secretary Benson said, you guys are critical players in this game. You are the ones with the voices. You are the ones with the networks. You are the ones that can help folks understand how important it is to be a hands-on, in-person player in our democracy. So aside from the gamesmanship and the political pugilism, please take a little bit of your time and advance the interests of your local election administrators, either locally at the state level or across the country. Thank you.
Similarly, I was going to say, work as hard as you do on your issue or your candidate of choice on the foundation of democracy. Teach people who don't know the system, how the system works. Ultimately, policy will reflect the people better when more people understand how to impact policy. Do that.
My message is thank you. Thank you to Quentin, who represents NAACP in Nevada. Thank you to Craig, who works for Run for Something. Without them and without your efforts in your community, we wouldn't be sitting here. And just remember, we appreciate it. I'm also thankful. Harry Reid always said, hire and spend time with people smarter than you, and it'll make you better. I'm grateful for all the secretaries and Kim at this table because they make me better and they make me smarter. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Same.
All right, Secretary Benson, we'll wrap up with you.
I would just say also to all of you in this room, and on that note, as Cisco so definitely said, you're all smarter than us on a lot of things. Send things our way, suggestions that you have, ideas that you have, solutions that you've developed, research that you've done, because we all can be great recipients of that and partners as we work towards our collective goals of expanding and making real the promise of democracy for every citizen. And thank you all. It's such an honor to be here with you. And as you can see, I'm really fortunate enough to work with these incredible people. Thank you for including me in this. And I hope to see you all in person soon.
As you can see, we could talk about democracy all day, but thank you all for being here and enjoy the rest of Netroots.
And karaoke tonight. Right?
Bye, everyone.
Right?
What is that? Bye, guys.